So I'm a lawyer and a director of the Earth Law Alliance. And today I'm also speaking as a member of Marinet, which is a UK-based marine conservation organisation. And I humbly present this new case for consideration to the tribunal on behalf of the world's oceans and seas and the incredible diversity of life that lives within them. So this case concerns three interrelated issues, and they all contribute in some way to the depletion of the oceans. The first is the systemic issue of the lack of an integrated approach to ocean care and governance. And the second and third issues are symptoms of the first, and these are the extensive overfishing that is taking place and the current flawed approach to marine conservation. And just before I look at these issues, I probably don't need to remind us all of the importance of the oceans in absorbing carbon dioxide, in producing 85% of the Earth's oxygen, and in providing a huge amount of sustenance for many species, including humans. Over half of all life on Earth lives in the oceans, and it covers 70% of the Earth's surface. And of course, even though we give the oceans and the seas different names, in fact, it's all one vast, interconnected body of water. So in focusing on the first issue, the lack of integrated ocean care and governance, it's clear that a huge amount of evidence already exists that shows the scale and scope of the damage, waste, and cruelty being inflicted upon the oceans and its wildlife by humans. The threats to marine life include deep-sea mining and oil extraction and their rapid expansion, industrial dredging close to the shore of sand and aggregate, the widespread dispersal of plastics and other toxins in the ocean, sewage and agricultural runoff being pumped into the sea, millions of birds and mammals being killed by nets, lines, and debris of all kinds, and fish farming, which negatively impacts upon native species. Coral reefs being destroyed by fishing gear, and of course ocean acidification is also happening, which has emerged as possibly the greatest threat of all. So it's the inadequate and piecemeal governance system that's led to this shocking state of affairs. And many of us now realize that our current approach to ocean care is not working and that systemic changes are needed. The current result of our fragmented worldview is a proliferation of confusing declarations, recommendations, treaties, and resolutions, and of multinational bodies and international authorities, all of which have mostly failed to safeguard the sea. And over the last 50 years, there have been over 500 international agreements on the environment, ranging from protecting the ozone layer and Antarctica's ice, to sharing genetic resources and reducing overfishing. There have never been so many targets, so many pledges, so many protocols agreed to so little positive effect. Meanwhile, ecosystems continue to decline, ocean acidification gets worse, and climate change accelerates. And it's notable, for example, that ocean acidification is not dealt with specifically in any international agreement and remains a kind of legal outcast. So ocean authorities become aware of environmental problems as isolated concerns, often after the damage has been done. And then they react to each problem with a new policy or a new regulation, which is often too weak and usually too late to effect a remedy. And this is a map showing some of the ways in which the ocean is zoned. So there are 18 regional fisheries management organizations, and they're charged by the United Nations Law of the Sea with managing fish resources sustainably. However, in spite of this, in 2012, it was found that 67% of commercial fish stocks under regional fisheries management were recorded as depleted or overfished. That's almost 70%. And furthermore, large areas of the Pacific, Indian, and Atlantic Oceans remain unmanaged and vulnerable to excessive exploitation. So things like harmful bottom trawling in these regions is largely unregulated. So in relation to this first issue of lack of integrated ocean care and governance, I humbly ask the Rights of Nature Tribunal to consider the extent to which the current system of ocean governance is a violation of the rights of Mother Earth, and in particular, the right to the ocean to maintain its identity and integrity as a distinct, self-regulating and interrelated being, the right to life and to exist, and the right to continue its vital cycles and processes free from human disruption. And in part two of this case, I would like to look at overfishing, mainly because it's such a huge threat to biodiversity. And specifically, I would like the Tribunal to consider whether the European Union's continuous and ongoing overfishing for many decades is a violation of the rights of Mother Earth and an unfolding crime of ecocide against many species of fish. Of all human activities in the ocean, many observers consider that overfishing has had the most devastating impact on marine life. And as I mentioned before, almost 70% of the world's commercial fish species are either overexploited, fully exploited, or depleted. And yet governments often turn a blind eye to this crisis and disregard scientific evidence on how to manage it better. They're frequently beholden to business and industry. And several governments even make the problems worse with millions of euros of subsidies being given to fund industrial fishing and other destructive activities. So in this part of the case, I ask the Tribunal to consider whether some European Union countries and their fisheries ministers are committing violations of the rights of Mother Earth and contributing to ecocide by not fully complying with the legal requirements established by the reform of the Common Fisheries Policy, which came into force in January 2014. So prior to that date, the EU had a notorious record for overfishing and for setting catch levels for commercial fish stocks which exceeded scientific advice in a very large number of cases. And then a window of light opened with the advent of the reformed Common Fisheries Policy in 2014, which involved the European Parliament for the first time. And when it was agreed that annual catch levels, known as total allowable catches, should accord with scientific advice in order to enable fish stocks to be rebuilt to safe and sustainable levels. This policy is now a legal requirement of the reformed Common Fisheries Policy. Since 2014, the reality has proved very disturbing. In the case of northern European fish, in 2015, the fisheries ministers set catch levels for 96 fish stocks, which involved 28 species. 60 of those 96 stocks were given catch levels higher than scientists had advised. And just to give you an idea of the impact that this kind of thing has, this is the spawning stock of cod in the North Sea and how it's gone down alarmingly since the 1960s. And there's a similar story for the Baltic Sea fish stocks. There are 10 stocks, and in 5 cases, the ministers exceeded scientific advice. And actually, in 2016, they exceeded scientific advice in 8 out of 10 of the stocks. So not only are they acting illegally, but their observance of the law is actually getting worse. And then lastly, deep sea stocks. There are 16 governed by scientific advice. And the 2015 catch levels set were higher than advised by scientists in 11 of the 16 stocks. And this has a very serious ecological impact because deep sea fish stocks breed very slowly, and so overfishing impacts them particularly adversely. So in summing up, I assert that fisheries ministers of the EU have acted illegally under EU law and also in violation of Article 2 of the rights of Mother Earth. That is the right to life and to exist, and the right of these fish species to continue their vital cycles and processes free from human disruptions. And I would also ask the Tribunal to consider whether industrial fishing practices, such as with huge trawlers, which employ seabed bottom trawling techniques that raise and destroy everything on the seabed, violate the rights of Mother Earth, and whether, in fact, such practices amount to a cumulative ecocide in the ocean. And so, my final part of this case, the current inadequacy of marine conservation zones. So I would like the Tribunal to consider the failure of many governments to create enough marine conservation areas, even though such areas are known to be vital for the maintenance of healthy ocean ecosystems. When left undisturbed, habitats can recover and depleted populations of marine life can flourish. The recovery of ecosystems and species populations can be remarkable, such as the 15-fold increase in the number of yellowtail snappers after only 4 years of the founding of a marine reserve in Florida. However, the process of establishing a marine reserve is long and involved. It can take many years of negotiations and compromises between the parties. There's always a period of time between identifying an area of sea that is in need of protection and then jumping the bureaucratic hurdles that have to be jumped in order to protect it. And the delay in between these can actually accelerate the damage. So as an illustration of this, this is the Darwin Mounds. It's a deep-sea cold-water coral reef off of the coast of Scotland. And an announcement was made that it was going to be closed in order to protect it. And for some time, more destructive trawling happened there because the fishermen knew it would be closed. And I don't know how well you can see this, but there are almost 6,000 areas of sea with some degree of protection around the world. However, many are too small and too fragmented to be effective, and in total they cover less than 1% of the world's oceans. Indeed, the mobility and fluidity of water means that it does not make sense to fence off parts of the sea. So, for instance, top predators such as swordfish, tuna, and shark are in urgent need of protection, but they swim over vast distances during their lives and are not beholden to a neat circle drawn on a map. So in saying this, I do not intend to diminish or underestimate the enormous conservation value of marine reserves. However, even if WWF's target is achieved of 20% of the oceans protected by 2020, this will still leave 80% of the oceans at the mercy of commercial exploitation, acidification, and other forms of pollution. So in the third and final part of this case, I ask the prosecutors of the tribunal to consider whether it is in alignment with the rights of Mother Earth for countries to protect only small parts of the ocean, and in particular whether this practice complies with the following provisions of Article 2. The right of the ocean and its inhabitants to life and to exist, the right to be respected, the right to continue their vital cycles free from human disruptions, the right to integral health, and the right to full and prompt restoration. And I also ask the tribunal to consider whether Article 3 of the Universal Declaration is being violated, in that arguably human beings have failed to establish and apply effective norms and laws for the defense, protection, and conservation of the rights of the oceans. So just in conclusion, I have a question. What if we at last acknowledge that all seas and oceans possess their own sovereignty and have an inherent right to exist, and thus should be cared for by humans as if they are a single, universal marine reserve? If the current paradigm were reversed, there would be no need for marine reserves. Commercial use would be permitted only if it were rational and truly sustainable. There would instead be marine industry zones, areas of responsible commercial activity, which preserve clean, healthy, and vibrant waters. Industry would no longer be allowed to deplete and destroy, and misusing the oceans would be a criminal act. The health of the marine environment would then always take priority over selfish interests and profit-making at any cost. So if you can imagine overfishing and destructive mining being a thing of the past, pollution and plastic waste diminishing and eventually disappearing, and wildlife flourishing, all oceans would effectively become one interconnected reserve, safe from damaging practices and over-exploitation. Imagine that. Thank you.
Lisa,
Yeah.
who do you think, or who do you consider are the perpetrators?
Well, it depends which part you're looking at, but I think in the case of overfishing, we could look at on a global level, but my aim here was to bring awareness to the EU in particular, and the fact that even though they have laws that require them to follow scientific advice, they're still setting these catch limits far too high. And indeed, they're meeting, I think, next week to agree the quotas for 2016. So in the overfishing, we could look beyond the EU, but I've focused on the EU. With conservation zones, I would say many governments could be, you could take so many examples of where there aren't enough conservation areas or where they've made pledges to set them up and they haven't followed them through. The UK would be one example of that, where I think they promised to set up 127 conservation areas and they've so far managed to set up about 33 of them, I believe. So in following through with the case, we would need to find specific instances where things have been violated.
Osprey. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep it really brief. In the sense you were talking about ocean acidification in relationship to climate change and global warming, and I wondered if you would consider part of your case also the fossil fuel industry and other industries that are causing global warming, in the sense that this is one of the key reasons that we're losing coral reefs and so much damage to the ocean. If you could comment on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it is one of the most urgent issues to consider, and I think if we're looking at a systemic level, then that obviously needs to be included, and I hadn't focused on it because I think the climate change case had mentioned that to some degree, but I totally agree that that is absolutely part of the whole picture.
What would be the impact of the release of genetically engineered salmon in the US? How would this impact life in the ocean?
Well, I'm not a marine expert, so my knowledge of that is limited, but I do know about the impact of something about the impact of fish farms and the antibiotics in the water and how that impacts on native species. So I really can't comment on GMOs, but I think anything you release is because of the fluidity of water is going to have an impact on the rest of the life in that area. So I think we really have to apply the precautionary principle much more rigorously than we are doing at the moment.
Lisa, thanks so much.